In the early 15th century, France was collapsing. For nearly 100 years, the kingdom had been consumed by the 100 Years' War. English armies occupied vast territories. French nobles betrayed one another. Famine, disease, and violence had hollowed out the land. Entire villages vanished. Trade routes failed. Hope became dangerous. The French crown itself was disputed. The king, Charles VII, ruled only a fraction of his kingdom and was mocked as the King of Bourges. Many believed he was not the rightful ruler at all. Paris had fallen. Northern France was lost. Now the English laid siege to Orléans, the last major city standing between them and total victory. If Orléans fell, France would be split in two permanently. Most believed the nation was already dead. What no one expected was that its survival would begin with a child. As we dive into this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. Domremy was the kind of village history usually forgets. It sat quietly along the Meuse River, surrounded by forests and farmland, far from royal courts and battlefields. There were no stone walls, no towers, no markets filled with wealth. Just wooden homes, dirt roads, church bells, and the steady rhythm of survival. This was where Jeanne was born. Her family were peasants, tenant farmers who worked land that did not belong to them. Life was harsh but ordered. Days began before sunrise. Food depended on weather and luck. Winter meant hunger. Summer meant exhaustion. But even in this forgotten place, war was never far away. English and Burgundian forces roamed nearby regions. Villages were burned without warning. Refugees passed through Domremy with stories of slaughter. Children learned early that soldiers meant death, not protection. Jeanne grew up hearing these stories. She was known as deeply religious. She attended Mass whenever possible. She prayed constantly. But she was not considered strange or isolated. She laughed, worked, and lived like other children. Until the voices came. Jeanne was 13 years old when it happened. She was alone in her father's garden on a summer afternoon when a sudden brightness filled the air around her. She later described it as a great light, accompanied by a voice so clear it startled her. It spoke her name. Jeanne fell to her knees in terror. At first she thought it was a trick of the mind. Or a test from God. She said nothing to anyone. She prayed for forgiveness, fearing she had imagined something sinful. But the voice returned. Again and again. It told her to live purely, to attend church, to obey God. Only later did it speak of France. The voices named themselves, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They spoke with authority, not confusion. They did not shout. They commanded. They told her France was suffering, that Orléans must be saved, that the Dauphin must be crowned king, and that she was the one chosen to do it. Jeanne did not want this fate. She cried when the voices returned. She begged them to leave her alone. She knew what happened to people who claimed divine visions. They were mocked, imprisoned, or burned. She was a peasant girl. She had no training, no protection, no right to speak to nobles, let alone kings. For years she resisted. But the war crept closer. Armed men passed near Domremy. One attack forced villagers to flee temporarily. Jeanne saw what happened when cities fell. The voices grew more urgent. They told her time was running out. By the time Jeanne turned 16, she understood something terrible and unavoidable. If she stayed silent, France would fall. She confided in a few trusted people. Some were frightened. Others believed her sincerity. Slowly, rumors spread of a girl who claimed God had chosen her. Then Jeanne did something unthinkable. She left home. Without permission, without protection, she traveled to the nearby garrison town of Vaucouleurs. There, she demanded to see the local commander and told him she had come to lift the siege of Orléans. He laughed at her. She was turned away. She returned. She was mocked. She came again. And this time, she spoke with a certainty that unsettled everyone who heard her. She predicted a French defeat that had just occurred, news that had not yet reached the town. She described the suffering of the kingdom with unnerving clarity. Something about her refusal to yield began to change minds. Reluctantly, the commander agreed to send her onward. Not because he believed her, but because he feared ignoring her might be worse. Jeanne cut her hair short. She dressed in men's clothing for safety. She mounted a horse and set out across enemy-controlled territory toward the royal court. She was 16 years old. She had no army, no rank, no proof. Only an unshakable belief that her voice, real or imagined, was guiding her toward something far larger than herself. Whether France would be saved or destroyed now depended on whether anyone would listen to a child no one was supposed to believe. And this was only the beginning. The royal court of France was not a place for miracles. It was a place of whispers, paranoia, and exhaustion. When Jeanne arrived at Chinon, where Charles VII held his court, she entered a world rotting from doubt. The halls were filled with nobles who no longer trusted one another. Advisors argued constantly. Betrayal had become routine. Many believed France was already lost and that Charles himself was a doomed ruler waiting for inevitable defeat. This was not a court searching for hope. It was a court afraid of it. Jeanne's arrival caused immediate unease. A teenage peasant girl, uneducated, poorly dressed, claiming divine instruction, was dangerous. Not because she might be wrong but because desperate people might believe her. Charles did not rush to see her. He waited. 4 days, Jeanne was kept at the edges of power, watched closely. Every word she spoke was reported. Every gesture examined. If she showed madness, she would be dismissed. If she showed arrogance, she would be silenced. Instead, she showed only certainty. And that frightened them more. When Charles finally agreed to meet her, he decided to expose her as a fraud. The great hall was filled with courtiers. Silks, jewels, and armor reflected torchlight. At the far end sat a man dressed as king, placed deliberately on the throne. Charles stood among his nobles, wearing plain clothing. It was a trap. If Jeanne approached the false king, she would be humiliated and dismissed immediately. She entered the hall. She paused. Her eyes moved across the room. Then she walked past the throne without hesitation. She stopped before Charles. She knelt. And she addressed him as the rightful king of France. The hall fell silent. Some laughed nervously. Others felt something colder, unease. This was not chance. Charles took Jeanne aside. No witnesses were present. No scribes recorded what was said. But when they returned, Charles was visibly shaken. Later accounts claimed Jeanne told him a secret prayer he had made alone, something only he believed God knew. Others said she spoke of his doubts, his fear that he was not the true heir. Whatever she said, it worked. For the first time in years, Charles allowed himself to believe. But belief alone could not protect him. A girl claiming divine voices was a political weapon, and a spiritual risk. If Jeanne were a heretic, supporting her could destroy Charles completely. The church demanded examination. For weeks, Jeanne was interrogated by theologians and clergy in Poitiers. They questioned her relentlessly. They searched for contradictions. They pressed her on doctrine, obedience, and sin. She did not falter. She answered complex theological questions with calm clarity. When she did not know an answer, she admitted it. When she did, she spoke plainly without embellishment. They could find no heresy, no madness, no deception. Their final judgment was cautious but extraordinary. There was nothing evil in her words or actions. The responsibility returned to the king. Charles VII understood the risk. If Jeanne failed, he would be ridiculed as a fool who trusted a child. If she succeeded, she could unite a nation that no longer believed in him. France was already dying. He chose to gamble. Jeanne was given armor, not ornate but functional. She was given a white banner bearing religious symbols. She was not made a commander, but she was placed with the army as a figure of inspiration. She would not lead through authority. She would lead through belief. As she mounted her horse and prepared to ride toward Orléans, seasoned soldiers stared in disbelief. Some laughed. Others crossed themselves. No one could explain why a king would trust a peasant girl with the fate of France. Not yet. But the war was about to change. And so was the meaning of power. By the time Jeanne approached Orléans, the city was already dying. 4 months, English forces had surrounded it, cutting supply lines, bombarding its walls, and slowly starving its people into submission. Food was rationed to desperation. Horses, dogs, and rats were eaten. Disease spread through overcrowded homes. Each sunrise brought fewer living faces to the streets. Orléans was not just another city. It was the final barrier. If it fell, the English would control the Loire Valley. Southern France would be exposed. Charles VI's claim to the throne would collapse. The idea of France as a nation would end, not dramatically but quietly through exhaustion. French commanders knew this. And they had already accepted defeat. The soldiers defending Orléans no longer believed in victory. They repaired walls because it was expected, not because they thought it mattered. Morale had rotted. Every failed sortie confirmed what they already feared. The English were too strong. The siege was too tight. Relief was not coming. Then Jeanne arrived. She did not sneak into the city under cover of darkness. She rode openly, carrying her white banner high, passing through cheering crowds who had been starved of hope for so long they barely recognized it. She told them plainly. The siege would be lifted. The city would not fall. France was not finished. Some believed her immediately. Others watched in silence, afraid to hope again. Jeanne was unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. She did not swear. She did not drink. She ordered prostitutes and looters removed from camp. She insisted on prayer before battle. She spoke to hardened men as if defeat were a choice they had simply forgotten how to refuse. She did not argue tactics. She spoke of destiny. And somehow it worked. Soldiers who had fled battles now stood their ground. Men who expected death followed her into danger because standing beside her felt safer than hiding behind walls. The English noticed the change immediately. They mocked her at first, called her a witch, or a child playing soldier. Then they began to fear her. Against the advice of veteran commanders, Jeanne urged an assault on the English fortifications. The attack was brutal. Arrows fell in waves. Cannon fire shook the earth. Bodies collapsed in the mud. At one point, Jeanne was struck by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. She was carried from the field, bleeding heavily. The soldiers thought it was over. Minutes passed. Then Jeanne returned. She mounted her horse again, banner raised, wounds still bleeding. Witnesses later said her return felt like something supernatural, not because she was invincible but because she refused to remain down. The assault resumed. The English line broke. Over the next 9 days, something unprecedented happened. The French attacked again and again. Each time they pushed further. English strongholds fell one by one. The invaders, so confident, so entrenched, began to retreat. The siege that was supposed to last until Orléans starved instead collapsed in disbelief. On May 8, 1429, the English abandoned the field. Orléans was free. Church bells rang across the city. People wept openly in the streets. Soldiers fell to their knees. For the first time in decades, France had not merely survived. It had won. News traveled faster than armies. Word spread that a peasant girl had broken the siege no one else could. That English forces had fled before her banner. That fear itself had finally changed sides. Jeanne did not celebrate. She warned the king not to hesitate. Victory, she said, was fragile. Now was the moment to strike, not with swords alone but with legitimacy. The Dauphin must be crowned. France must see its king anointed. Delay would undo everything. For the first time, Charles VII listened without hesitation. Because Orléans had proven something no one could deny. A child had walked into a dying city. And walked out having saved a nation. Victory should have protected Jeanne. It did not. After Orléans and the coronation at Reims, Jeanne had become something far more dangerous than a soldier. She was a symbol. A living challenge to the old order. Proof that authority could come from faith instead of birth, from conviction instead of bloodlines. And symbols make powerful enemies. At first, Jeanne was celebrated everywhere she went. Crowds gathered to see her. Soldiers wanted to fight beside her. The people spoke her name as if it were a prayer. But among nobles and commanders, admiration quietly turned into discomfort. Jeanne did not belong to them. She was not trained. She did not follow courtly etiquette. She spoke plainly, sometimes bluntly, even to those of high rank. She urged continued offensives when cautious men preferred negotiation. She reminded everyone, especially the king, that hesitation was dangerous. Her certainty exposed their fear. Gradually, her influence was reduced. Military decisions were made without her. She was kept at the edges of command. The momentum she had created began to slow. Jeanne felt it. She warned that delay would cost lives. She begged to continue pressing the advantage. But France, newly crowned and newly cautious, chose politics over prophecy. The war dragged on. In the spring of 1430, Jeanne rode to defend the town of Compiègne against Burgundian forces, French allies aligned with the English. During a skirmish outside the city walls, chaos erupted. Retreat was ordered. Jeanne stayed behind, covering the withdrawal. The gates closed. She was surrounded. Dragged from her horse, she was captured, not by English soldiers, but by fellow Frenchmen who saw her as valuable property. She was imprisoned, chained, and eventually sold to the English for a reward. France did nothing. The king she had crowned did not ransom her. The nation she had saved fell silent. The English understood one thing clearly. They could not allow Jeanne to remain a hero. If she had been truly sent by God, then England's cause was unjust. Their only option was to destroy her credibility. They put her on trial for heresy. The trial violated nearly every rule of church law. The judges were openly hostile. Jeanne was denied legal counsel. She was interrogated endlessly, often tricked with theological traps designed to force a fatal mistake. She was alone. She was 19. And she was facing men trained to destroy her with words instead of swords. Still she endured. She answered calmly. She corrected her interrogators when they misstated doctrine. She refused to deny her voices, even when threatened with torture. When asked whether she was in God's grace, a question meant to condemn her either way, she answered with stunning clarity. If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there. Even her judges were shaken. But the verdict was never in doubt. On May 30, 1431, Jeanne was taken to the marketplace in Rouen. She was dressed in a simple gown. Chains bound her. A tall wooden stake stood waiting. She asked for a cross. A soldier broke a stick in two and tied it together for her. She held it tightly as flames were lit beneath her feet. Witnesses later said she called out the name of Jesus repeatedly as smoke rose around her. Some wept. Some turned away. Even among the English soldiers there was fear. When it was over, her ashes were thrown into the river, to prevent relics, to erase memory. But memory does not burn. Jeanne died. Her cause did not. Within 20 years, English forces were driven almost entirely from France. The kingdom reunited. Charles VII ruled as king, because of a coronation made possible by a child he later abandoned. Years after her death, the church reopened her case. The trial was declared corrupt. The verdict was overturned. Jeanne was declared innocent. Centuries later, she was canonized. A peasant girl, executed as a heretic, became a saint. She entered history not as a soldier or a ruler, but as proof that even in the darkest moments, the fate of a nation can rest in the hands of a child who refuses to believe defeat is inevitable. And that is why her story survived the fire. Jeanne of Arc was gone. But her impact was eternal. The streets of France would never forget the child who walked into a siege-ravaged city and brought hope where there was none. Orléans became more than a city, it became a symbol of resilience. Charles VI's coronation at Reims secured the legitimacy of the French crown, not because of armies alone, but because one child had dared to act when everyone else despaired. Her story spread through whispers, songs, and letters. Villagers told their children about the girl who challenged kings, defied generals, and faced death without fear. Soldiers remembered the courage she instilled, and historians wrote of her daring centuries later. Even after centuries of war, political upheaval, and societal change, Jeanne's legacy endured. She taught the world a lesson that resonates still. Courage is not measured by size or strength. Power is not only in armies or thrones. Faith in one's conviction, pure, unwavering, and brave, can change the course of history. She saved France not with swords, not with strategy, not with nobility. She saved it with belief. A nation that seemed destined to fall rose because a child refused to accept defeat. And sometimes, the fate of the world rests in the hands of someone no one expects. Her life, her death, and her legend remind us all. History is shaped not only by kings and generals, but by those willing to stand for what is right, even when the world doubts them. Jeanne of Arc, the child who saved a nation, will forever live in memory as proof that courage, conviction, and faith can alter the course of humanity. France survived. Jeanne survived in spirit. And the story of a single child who changed the fate of a nation will never be forgotten.